Nowhere else in America that I'm aware of was this feudal system permitted.
A lot of these houses are still here, and they still have the history that makes Rensselaerville so unique and so charming.
It's important to remember that this was a part of American history, that these revolts were very real.
The Van Rensselaer family owned this very large tract of land, and Stephen Van Rensselaer II began to develop the land by dealing with leases, leasing land to potential farmers.
Where this was at one time a very important commercial center for this area, the village itself, which today only has about 150 people, had close to 3,000 people.
However, he passed away very, very early in his life and left this entire patroonship to his son, Stephen Van Rensselaer III, who inherited everything at the age of 5.
Van Rensselaer died in 1839, Van Rensselaer III, and then the reversion to the stricter regime begins pretty quickly thereafter. Parts of the United States, or what was to become the United States, were run on a fee simple system whereby people owned their plots either outright or rented in such a way as they would not owe the kinds of fealty, as they said, to the one big landowner.
He was called the Good Patroon. Called the Good Patroon because he was extraordinarily generous. Van Rensselaer gets all of these farms going, 3,000 farms going, okay? And so he says to himself, well, if those farming techniques are continuing to be used, then I'm not going to be able to collect rents in a few years because these people won't, the land will become less and less productive.
He probably figured, one could imagine that he assumed, that eventually by drawing in these people who would settle on the land, that he would make a lot of money selling the land to them.
And so he hires a man named Amos Eaton, who was a very well-educated guy. He hires Eaton to do a survey of the two counties to determine where the best land is for farming.
He thought by bringing people in, he would be bringing the land under cultivation. The land would become more valuable, and eventually he would sell it to them, probably at relatively low prices. But he would be he would become wealthier through the sale himself.
The revolution was over. No money, no land, and no way of making a living.
After the revolution, when there was a period of economic dislocation, actually, these were fairly good areas for veterans to come back to if they had minimal property. They could acquire land pretty quickly. And because the patroon at the time, Stephen Van Rensselaer, was relatively lax in the treatment of those who lived on his land, this was a good place to start up, to get going. And that's what happened. Not everyone there was a revolutionary veteran, but the veterans who were coming back, they had their own dislocations from the war.
Most of the war veterans either came from Connecticut, possibly Massachusetts. A few came up the Hudson Valley, some came from Long Island. But at that point, most people were farmers or tradespeople, and they had 10 or 12 children in the family. So there was no land for them to have because their parents had it, so they were looking for fresh land. And one of the last areas to be developed was the hill towns and the Helderbergs of Albany County, and that was mainly because there was no highways, there's no roads, there's no transportation to this area, and it was only after the war that Stephen Van Rensselaer opened this area up for settlement. And to entice these soldiers, he offered 7 years of free land. But there was a little kick to that, and if you lived here for 7 years, then after that you had to start paying a lease. And it was a perpetual lease, so you never could get out of it.
Let's say that you wanted to lease 100 acres of land, and Van Rensselaer says, I'll be glad to lease you 100 acres of land. But before we sign the lease, here is the deal. You will pay me rent every year of 3 sacks of grain and 2 chickens. Or you have a choice. You can bring your team and your wagon or your conveyance of one kind, sleigh, whatever, and you can bring that, and I can have use of that for 1 day a year.
It was a quit rent system. It isn't a term rent. This was without any ending period. It was understood as a permanent relationship. The obligation continued from you to your children to the next person.
Your progeny, your kids, right on down the line, can continue to operate this piece of property. If you want to cut wood on the property, that's fine. You can build a house with it, you can burn the wood, but you can't sell the lumber.
What's interesting about these arrangements was that they were very long-term. They more or less bound people to the land in a way not unlike that of a feudal situation. But the arrangements, the contracts would last for a very long time. They were in perpetuity. They were not there for just a set period of time as you do with the normal rent.
If you were a really good farmer, I don't think this was a problem. If you were a marginal farmer, might have been difficult at certain times.
The patroon system was not irrational, but it was radically inconsistent with American values in the 19th century, which privileged the property owner.
No matter whether he was the good patroon or not, he was still the landlord. The system was not just carried out in Rensselaerville. It was also carried out in other places in the Hudson Valley.
They actually named the town after Stephen Van Rensselaer, and they wanted to call it Rensselaerville, but Stephen Van Rensselaer felt that would be very confusing, so they named it Rensselaer, and then they just added the word ville on it, which just means village.
There's 5 hamlets. There's Potter Hollow, Preston Hollow, Cooksburg, Medusa, and Rensselaerville that make up the town of Rensselaerville.
The village of Rensselaerville started with probably a very few log cabins, and they were probably, the first one was built in 1788, but very shortly after that, frame houses were started.
They had an incredibly good deal. They were not being charged rent. These are mostly people coming who didn't have a lot of assets, so they could move onto land, they could settle it, they could farm it, they didn't have to pay any rent, they didn't have mortgages, they didn't have anything else. They had a great deal.
The village itself is so picturesque. It's a beautiful village, and very proud of our history, I guess. The fact that it's been there and it's grown, and there was just the one industry, the felt industry, that put it on the map.
1843. Rensselaerville reached its peak. Forest and streams were tapped. No farmland remained unsold.
The original settlers to this area of Rensselaerville actually didn't settle here in the village of Rensselaerville. They settled about 2 miles west of here on a place they called Pisgah, or Meeting House Hill, and they actually built a church there. There was a store, and there was a couple houses. But this was in the late 1780s.
Or New Englanders moving west, which was a significant portion of the people who moved in, it provided more fertile land, because however much that land would get exhausted, it was incredibly fertile.
By 1788, a gentleman came out of Massachusetts, and his name was Samuel Jenkins, and he built a log cabin in the village across from where the grist mill now stands.
The grist mill was built by Mr. Jenkins in 1789. It burned down in 1879, and it was rebuilt in 1880. It was built on the 10-mile creek. The water was used to turn the wheel that ran the mill.
By 1800, tanneries, grist mills, and other small-scale factories were scattered along the 10-mile creek.
They are a part of every early modern economy.
They were all along the 10-mile creek. The lowest one was down at the bottom of the creek, and that was known as the lower mill, and that was built by Jonathan Jenkins. The middle mill, which is where our present grist mill is, and that was the Samuel Jenkins mill. And then there was also a grist mill built part of the way up the falls, and it's known as the upper mill, and that one had several different lives. It started as a grist mill. Then it became a woolen mill where the farmers would bring their sheep wool in, and it would be then made into wool so that they could take it back and spin it. And then eventually that became a felting mill, and then it was finally closed down in the late 1870s.
For clothing, you need tanneries, and that is, how do you use the cattle? You want to use all of it. Tanneries are essential. Grist mills, I mean, you need to be able to grind the grain. You know, if you're going to have farms, you're going to have this.
They were so essential to farmers, you know. They served that purpose for grinding grain and like that. And then, of course, the felt mill, which became a big business when they moved to Rensselaer. But it started here in Rensselaerville.
Part of the big advantages of this part of the country is lots of flowing water, because the central form of power to make those kinds of mills work is water power.
March 13th, 1798. For a means of literary information, settlers collect funds. They establish the Federal Library.
The late 18th century, there's a huge explosion of the desire of education as a value, as a public value. An educated populace was understood as central to making a republic work.
The Rensselaerville Library started in 1798, and it started with 3 individuals that were the early settlers: Isaac Hayes, Samuel Fuller, and Samuel Jenkins, and they each brought a share for $2 apiece. In a short time, 186 people joined and bought shares in the library at $2 apiece, and they hired a librarian for $3 for the year. The library was a very active thing until 1832, when there was a special meeting of all the shareholders to sell the books. Why they sold them, we really don't know, but the library was not reestablished until 1896, and it's still residing in the same building.
Samuel Jenkins, the first to settle among the somber hemlocks and majestic pines.
Even though he didn't own the rights to this great lot, which is Great Lot 249, Hans Winokur actually got the lease from Stephen Van Rensselaer, but he was actually one of the very first people to put up a building, and he actually built 3 buildings. His log cabin burnt down, he put up a frame building, that one burnt down, he put up the 3rd building, and he lived there until his son, Jonathan Jenkins, who became a very famous lawyer in this area and was a representative for Stephen Van Rensselaer, taking care of the leases, and then he built the large house that's across from the playground, which is the Jenkins estate, which still stands.
Rensselaerville, with its dense forest and powerful stream, one after another, a settlement grew.
Part of the reason why this town was so prosperous, people moved to this town because of the trees, because of the tanning industry, which was its really early use. But it also was a very big farming community until the land finally gave out. The community really started as a milling community, and then it became prosperous as the more industry came into the town, and also more professionals, the doctors, the lawyers, the undertaker. They were all part of the village.
The farmers were protesting about having to pay the patroon rent and living up here and doing all the work and everything and still having to pay rent. but in some way they rebelled, and I guess that's what people remember. The anti-rent war. It wasn't really a war, but protest.
It was mean, it was nasty, it was violent. It wasn't mass slaughter or anything, but it was very, very rough. It was very dangerous to be in the middle of all of that.
He had land and he had money, and he was taking from the poor farmers who didn't have money.
What made it brutish and long and weird is that even though everybody agreed this was un-American, they found it so hard to think their way outside of the box, to undo it.
The Hudson Valley in particular had a system of land tenure and land renting, really, that was very, very different from the norm in the United States, in what was to become the United States in the Revolutionary era. Since the good patroon was so relatively lax in his handling of these arrangements, it was only at his death that the problems began to arise.
Certainly Van Rensselaer's policy of allowing rents to go unpaid for many years, and then his insistence upon their collection in his will, brought the tenant discontent to a head.
Things take a turn in 1844 when some of the renters begin disguising themselves and actually attacking the rent collectors. When the rent collectors come to actually pick up the rents that were owed, they would be attacked. It was a kind of a terrorist campaign, if you will. What was interesting about those attacks is that the renters were dressed up as Indians.
They may not have thought of themselves as being Indians, they may have thought of themselves as being like the American revolutionaries. And just as the American revolutionaries resisted dressing up as Indians to throw the tea into Boston Harbor, so they were resisting in the same way.
They work the land. They live off the land. They should own the land.
So the new patroon, Stephen Van Rensselaer IV, is, will have no truck with this disorderly behavior, what he considers disorderly behavior, and it becomes all the worse when the renters start these organized, what looks like organized bands of resistors. But it really gets complicated after the official in Delaware County is killed, because then it's a matter not just for local authorities to be involved, but for state authorities. And Governor Silas Wright has to take action, and decides to take action against to put down what he sees as a rebellion.
Increasingly, the tenants can use the metaphor of slavery as a way to explain why this is an illegitimate thing to impose on white farmers.
However, it would be a mistake to regard the anti-rent movement merely as an attack against the leaseholding system. The landlord became the whipping boy for all the farmers' ills. Many of the tenants in the Helderbergs were poor farms.
The aftermath of the anti-rent war has a lot to do with politics as much as anything else. When Governor Wright, who was a Democrat, who might be thought of as being sympathetic to the common man, the renters, when he said, no, we will not allow the peace to be disturbed, disorder will not be permitted, and he actually sends in forces to try and make sure that things are going to be restored to order.
The high cost of wheat in the years 1836 to 39 served to raise the annual rent. The hill farmers had the greatest difficulty in making the transition from subsistence farming, taking care of the family, to farms that sold products.
The anti-rent war, if you dig deeply into it, was a significant event in terms of the structure of New York State constitutional arrangements. So, these things were important, and in some ways it all leads up to what happened in that part of the world, that part of New York State.
Year 1790. Population 1,450. Year 1854. Population 3,629. Year 2000. Population 1,915. Rensselaerville, a small town, an unspoken history.
just love this town. I wake up in the morning and I look out and I see a pond, I see trees, I see deer, I see even all sorts of things. I just love it.
You look out and you just see, you can see wildlife most anywhere. It's quiet, it's tranquil. Like Rosie said, the stone walls are just superb.
Oh, it's beautiful, the big trees and everything is green. Beautiful village, beautiful.